Our scripture for today is Mark 7:24-30. If you have your Bibles, you can feel free to read along. Otherwise, I'll be reading from the New Living Translation. Then Jesus left Galilee and went north to the region of Tyre. He didn't want anyone to know which house he was staying in, but he couldn't keep it a secret. Right away, a woman who had heard about him came and fell at his feet. Her little girl was possessed by an evil spirit, and she begged him to cast out the demon from her daughter. Since she was a Gentile, born in Syrian Phoenicia, Jesus told her, "First, I should feed the children, my own family, the Jews. It isn't right to take food from the children and throw it to the dogs." She replied, "That's true, Lord, but even the dogs under the table are allowed to eat the scraps from the children's plates." "Good answer," he said. "Now go home, for the demon has left your daughter." And when she arrived, she found her little girl lying quietly in bed, and the demon was gone.
Thanks, Laura, for that reading. So this is a tricky passage. It's partly what happens when you go through a book, just verse by verse, section by section in the sermon series. You don't get to kind of jump over the uncomfortable parts. It should be uncomfortable for us when we talk about Jesus who makes people feel welcome. We hang a sign by the road that says, "Everyone welcome." We want to be a welcoming people, and we believe that Jesus' message of salvation is for everybody. And then we have a story like this where Jesus says, "Okay, hold on, I have to treat certain people better. I have to help certain people first. So you, even though I know your story, I'm not going to help you." It feels uncomfortable. It feels inconsistent with the model of Jesus that we've seen the rest of the gospel, certainly the rest of the Gospel of Mark. Now, when we find these passages, and there are a number of them in the Bible, sometimes we have to dig deep and find some sort of historical connection. Sometimes we have to write it off as a cultural something or other that's different from now. But this one, I think, is very clearly outlined when we read the previous story. So, I preached on this 2 weeks ago. We took Holiday Sunday off, and we're back at it again. So I will summarize that story, or at least that teaching. So Jesus is with his disciples, and they've traveled, and they've gone through the marketplace, and then they stop to eat, but, scandal of scandals, they don't wash their hands properly. Now, this isn't a big deal for us now, although for some, washing your hands is pretty important, and doing it the right way for the right amount of time used to be a pretty big deal for disease prevention and all of those things. But the disciples haven't washed their hands, which demonstrates to the religious elite around them that they aren't following the letter of the law carefully. And so this is pointed out. And then Jesus says to the crowds, including the religious elites and his followers, he says, "You guys need to pay attention, not just to the letter of the law, but you need to know that what goes into your mouth doesn't contaminate you." Right? Because all the leaders were saying, "Hey, listen, they may have touched something unclean in the marketplace. They may have touched meat that was butchered improperly. They might have touched meat that was not allowed for them to eat. They may have touched things that were impure. They may have touched people that were impure. And when you have this impurity on your hands, it gets onto the food and then into your body. But Jesus says that's not what makes you impure. What makes you impure is what comes out of your mouth, because what comes out of your mouth comes out of your heart. These are your values. So we don't really see much of a pushback from the crowd, but they must have been angry. But in the follow-up passage in between that story and this story, there's a conversation with Jesus and his followers, his disciples, the people who've dedicated their lives to following Jesus and learning from him. So after this public debate, there's a private lesson. And this is important for us to pay attention to these private lessons. The disciples, they have questions, understandably, because they're trying to be good worshipers of God, but for them that means to be good Jews. And Jewish religion was built on rules that didn't make sense to everybody else, but made sense to them. So we can imagine some of the extra conversation around this, right? They would have said, Jesus, really? Like, this is kind of a big deal for us. We don't eat pork because pork makes us unclean. So are you now saying we can eat pork? Are you now saying all these things that we can't do by Jewish religious laws, we can do them now? How does this work? And Jesus says he wants them to focus on the rules still. He isn't throwing the rules out the window. You know, sometimes this happens in our lives too, that our parents have given us rules as children. And then when we get old enough, then we can say, well, I'm going to do what I want now. And sometimes we get to throw those rules out. Sometimes we say, oh, maybe Mom sort of had a few things figured out. I'm gonna keep doing that. But we also do that religiously. Our parents had some different religious rules than we do. Maybe about the clothes that we wear, about the ways that we do business or not on Sundays. And so we've adjusted. Some of it is just the shifting tides of society. Some of it is we have a close look at the Bible and we see maybe there's some flexibility that our parents didn't see. But now Jesus is telling them, no, these rules are still important. And you can see the rules in chapter 7, verse 21. My translation says, it's from the inside, from the human heart, that evil thoughts come. Sexual sins, thefts, murders, adultery, greed, evil actions, deceit, unrestrained immorality, envy, insults, arrogance, foolishness. All these evil things come from the inside and contaminate a person in God's sight. So Jesus isn't saying, okay, rules don't matter, just do your own thing. Jesus never says that. But to the religious elites, they're hearing Jesus say that. Right? Oh, all of a sudden, purity doesn't matter anymore. Food doesn't matter anymore. The Old Testament doesn't matter anymore. Is that what you're saying, Jesus? No, Jesus gives a long list of sins that he still wants his followers to focus on. But I think it's helpful to break down our understanding of rules into three groups. And some of this matters for us as we teach children what rules to follow. Some of this matters for the ways that we form our identity as a particular congregation. So the first layer of rules is one that comes with natural consequences. So if your child is playing near a campfire, then you pull your child back and you tell them, do not go near the fire. That's a rule. It's a good rule to have. Now, you could say, well, he'll only tumble into the fire once. Well, yeah, but there may be more damage done than you are willing to deal with as a parent. Right? There are natural consequences to certain actions. And sometimes we make rules to protect people from those natural consequences. And then there's kind of the next layer where there's what we might call judicial consequences. Where we kind of have to set up rules a certain way that we can't live this way, so we have a speed limit on the highway. Well, there are natural consequences of driving too fast, but sometimes those natural consequences only come way later, and they cause more damage to other people, and so we put rules in place to impose extra consequences on top of the natural ones, so that people don't find out what the natural consequences are. And some of the rules that Jesus gives would fall into that category. So in this religious community, you have to uphold the integrity of marriage. If people are going to run around and commit adultery all the time, then marriages mean nothing, and there's no stability in the home. And so that's why that Jesus includes that in his list. If you're going to have a value-based community, then you have to have rules and order and common expectations. So those lists, the list that Jesus gives in verses 21 and 22, includes many of those things. Greed should be a rule in a religious community. You can't have everybody just fending for themselves when you're gathering together to celebrate the same values. In a capitalist society, greed is apparently pretty good and necessary, but within the confines of a religious community, you can't tolerate and celebrate greed. So this is one of the things that Jesus lists to his followers. But then there's another layer on top of that. The Jews had a long list of rules that separated them from the neighboring kingdoms. So one of them was pork. What are the natural consequences of eating pork? Well, the scientists will debate that, but there doesn't really seem to be any. In terms of the health of pork versus beef, well, we'll let the marketing companies decide, but I eat both, and I feel the same either one. So there doesn't seem to be natural consequences of eating pork. You can also go through the Old Testament, you'll find lots of rules about you don't sow certain crops side by side. You don't wear clothing woven of two fabrics. You maybe didn't know that's an Old Testament rule. It is. Most of us are now currently wearing clothing woven of two fabrics. I'm pretty fond of cotton polyester blends myself. They're pretty functional. We don't follow those same rules. We don't feel the need to differentiate ourselves from the Hittites and the Perizzites like the Jews did. So when Jesus is walking with his disciples and he's hearing this critique from the religious elites, he's seeing that they're saying, hey, these rules that set us apart from our neighbors, you guys aren't following them. Therefore, you are condemned in God's eyes. And Jesus says, well, they might make us bad Jews, but that's not what God ultimately cares about. God doesn't care about these rules that set us apart and make us feel better about ourselves. Right? It's fine to have rules that set you apart. When you follow sports, you see that the coach will sometimes impose rules on that team so that they live differently, think differently, separate themselves from all the distractions. Are there inherent benefits? No, but it's a thing that you do together as a team. That's fine if it makes you a better athlete, but you shouldn't go thinking that makes you a better person. So now Jesus has had this conversation with his disciples, and he's explained to them, listen, these rules are still important, but the food stuff, the understandings of moral purity connected to superficial things, they don't matter. They don't matter in God's eyes. So the disciples probably were not getting it, because their whole lives they had been taught about pork. Their whole lives they had been taught a long list of things about sacrifices and blood and all of the things that would make somebody pure or impure. And Jesus is kind of playing fast and loose with those boundaries in ways that should make them uncomfortable, because that's all they've ever known. So after this conversation has happened, along comes a woman, an immigrant woman from, she's a Syro-Phoenician woman, just not Jewish. That's really all we need to know. And so she comes onto the scene, and she has a question for Jesus. And we see a desperation in her voice. She has a child, and the child has been having issues. There's an issue with demon possession. We don't know exactly what that looks like, but in the story we know that the mother is concerned, and all of us know you don't get between a mother and her child. I was in Fernie this week, and we went out of our way to see this beautiful lake on the top of a mountain. It was picturesque. All the pictures we saw on the internet were fantastic. We got to the trailhead, and it was closed. And it said, trail closed because of an aggressive moose. So then we went to the next sign that showed the map to see if there was another way around. And then it explained that there's a moose with her calf, and she is protecting her calf, and do not get anywhere near that calf. So, natural consequences, again, right? If they put the sign up, if we had chosen to disregard that, right, they could have said, well, we told you. There would have been natural consequences to that decision. So here's Jesus, and this woman comes up, and she says, Jesus, listen, my daughter is demon-possessed, and I know, I've heard the stories, you've helped so many people with the same issue, and I can't help her. I don't know how to help her. The doctors that I've taken her to, they don't know how to help her. The only person who can help me is you. Please help my daughter. So, who of us would say no to that? Who of us would say no to that and pat ourselves on the back thinking that we had done a good, morally righteous thing? None of us. So then Jesus says, okay, well, hold on, listen, I've got to help the Jews first. And I think at some level, the disciples would have said, okay, yeah, and we're back the way that we're supposed to be. Because what is this woman doing? We don't know what she's been eating. Has she been eating pork? Has she been eating meat sacrificed to idols? Is she menstruating? If she is, then she's not following the rules, probably. There's no way of knowing because she's not following the Jewish rules. Because she's not Jewish, she is impure. And when you live an impure life, you deal with impure consequences. Except nothing about her was impure. She was a mother. She cared for her child. She wanted the best for her child. And she was going to do what she could to make that happen. And she wasn't going to let the rules of Jewish purity get in the way. So then, she responds. Right? Because Jesus says, hey, listen, I have to feed my children. I'm feeding God's children first, not the dogs. Right? We don't talk about people that way. Right? If I heard any of you in the foyer of this church talking about a human being as a dog, we would have a conversation. right? If you overheard me talking that way, I'd be gone. Understandably, right? Because this isn't the way that God has created us. So now Jesus is talking in a way that is deplorable to us. But I think that's the point. Because Jesus is behaving in this story exactly like the religious elites were behaving in the previous story. And I am confident that the point was Jesus is modeling his point from the previous story. Right? There are times where we feel a contrast, a conflict within us. Am I going to live out this value or that value? Am I going to uphold what this person said, or am I going to uphold what that person said? Am I going to live out my political beliefs or my religious beliefs? Am I going to pursue financial gain or spiritual gain? Am I going to look after my own interests or somebody else's? We face that conflict all the time. So I can only speculate, but I think the disciples would have been feeling that contrast. That, yeah, Jesus wants us to help people, but we don't know anything about this woman. We don't know where she's been. We don't know what she's eaten. We don't know anything about her family. It's best that she just leave us alone. So then she responds to Jesus. And she says, yeah, well, the dogs still eat. The dogs still eat. They sit around the table, and whatever falls off, they lap up enthusiastically. And that is me. I'm the dog. Drop some food from your table because my child is going to die. She loves her child. What's she going to do? Just accept that she's a lesser human being? No, she's not going to do that. So she comes back. She has another question. She reasserts her worth to Jesus. The different translations speak differently. I'm not sure this is the best translation. Laura's and mine both say the same thing, that Jesus responds and says, good answer. You ever watch Family Feud? And they're getting down. They've got a few strikes already, and then they've used up all of the obvious answers, and then somebody says something that's like completely insane. And then the whole rest of the family, what do they say? Good answer, good answer. Doesn't matter. It might be on the board. It's a thing. We're going to do it. We're going to go with it. Good answer. Right? Jesus hears this word of desperation, but also of conviction. Right? She's willing to take this model, this ugly description, and redeem it. Right? She's not a dog. Human beings aren't dogs. Dogs are good and lovely creatures, but when we compare humans to dogs, we're putting something that God has created with infinite worth, and we're taking some of that worth away. So then she says, okay, you want to play that game? That's fine. Even in that ugly game, even in that ugly description of me and my child, there is still something missing. Right? Because she's in the story, right? She's not denigrating Jesus. Jesus is painting a picture. There's a family meal, and a good and loving father has made sure that there is food for the father's family. We're all going to eat. And Jesus says, yeah, but that's only for the family, not for the dogs. She says, yeah, but the dogs still eat. I still need to be fed. The woman wasn't giving up. And in her insistence, she was showing love for her child. In her insistence, even though it sounded like she was breaking the rules, she was not giving up. She saw the worth in her child. She saw the beauty in her child, and she wasn't done. And Jesus said, "Good answer." So other translations will say it more poetically. You have answered correctly. Because she has. She has answered correctly. She has answered lovingly for her child. So, what are we supposed to learn from this? We sit with the disciples as students in this story. Jesus has modeled for them the correct understanding. The disciples and us, we would all have reason to judge her. What rules is she following? What has she done? Has she somehow made bad choices that resulted in her child ending up this way? Maybe she deserves this, and if Jesus isn't going to help her, then that's all the reason we need. But no. Jesus is using her as an example of what he's talking about. You can look at all of the exterior things. You can look for rule adherence. You can look for all the things that she is supposed to be doing, and you can see that they are not there. But listen to her words. Listen to her heart, and you will hear love. You will hear love for her daughter, and that is what you should be hearing. And if, we can say this to the disciples, if in any way you thought that this daughter did not deserve help, shame on you. Because she is showing more love than you. Of course she is. Of course this mother cares more for her daughter than you do. But if you don't want to help her because of the rules you think she's breaking, then you are not on the side of God. The hard thing about these stories is we sort of put a whole lot of shame on the disciples. And they understood the differences. And I could sit here and I could explain to you who the Syrophoenician people were, and I could explain the military conflicts between the various countries at that time, and then maybe academically you could sort of say, okay, that seems to make sense. I now understand in my mind the ways that they could have hated their neighbors. Then I would be appealing to the best of you. Allow me for a moment to appeal to the worst of you. There are people in your life that you don't think deserve help. There are people in your life that you are happy and eager to disregard because they vote the wrong way, they buy the wrong products, they consume the wrong products, they wear the wrong kind of clothes, they come from the wrong kind of places. The Jews had their Gentiles. The people Jesus was teaching in this story, they had people around them that they didn't like. And I could try to explain to you why they didn't like them, but you already know the people in your life that you don't like. And Jesus was calling his followers then, just like he's calling us now, to look past that. Yeah, if you love them, they're still going to vote the way you don't like. If you love them, they're probably still going to wear weird clothes. If you love them, they're probably still going to make wrong, irresponsible financial decisions. Yes, they probably will. But God still loves them. So in this uncomfortable story, this uncomfortable depiction of Jesus speaking in ways that are and should be uncomfortable to us, may we see a challenge to be more loving, to be more accepting, and more helpful than we might otherwise want to be.